I first noticed it in the way he remembered things I hadn't said out loud. Not secrets. Not confessions. Just details, pauses I'd left in sentences, thoughts I'd almost finished, choices I'd implied without naming. He never repeated them back to me. He simply adjusted his behavior as if he already knew. At first, I found it flattering. The kind of attention that feels rare because it isn't loud. He didn't interrupt. He didn't summarize. He just positioned himself correctly in every conversation. Once, he answered a question I hadn't asked yet. I laughed and said he'd guessed. He looked at me and said, "No. You hesitated." That was the first time I wondered when hesitation had become something visible. He never corrected my memory. Instead, he subtly replaced it. When I recalled events, he'd add a detail I wasn't sure about. Not contradicting me, extending the picture. Softly. Reasonably. As if he were helping me remember more accurately. At first, I resisted. I insisted on my version. But then I noticed something unsettling. His versions made more sense. They were cleaner. More coherent. Less emotional. And slowly, without realizing it, I started adopting them, not because he demanded it, but because they felt better. Once, I said, "That's not how I remember it." He replied, "Memory isn't a record. It's an interpretation." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Because I realized how often I'd been trusting my memory simply because it was mine. The first time I doubted my own recollection, it felt like maturity. I told myself this was growth. Perspective. The ability to see beyond initial impressions. I stopped clinging to first versions of events. I learned to revisit them. He never said I was wrong. He just asked, "Are you sure that's the only way it happened?" And suddenly, certainty felt naive. I started re-examining conversations long after they ended. Revisiting emotions. Adjusting interpretations. Not to agree with him, but to be more accurate. At least, that's what I called it. But one night, alone, I realized something disturbing. I could no longer describe a memory without wondering which version of it was actually mine. The shift didn't feel like losing memory. It felt like improving it. I began to revisit moments with a new habit, not asking what did I feel, but what actually happened. I learned to distrust emotions first. They were biased. Imprecise. Too invested in protecting my version of events. He never told me this. I concluded it myself. When something upset me, I waited before naming it. I replayed the scene until the feeling softened, until it could be explained as misunderstanding, timing, context. The more I revised, the more reasonable everything became. Once, I said, "Maybe I overreacted." He nodded. That's usually where clarity starts. That sentence became a quiet permission. I started correcting my reactions before anyone else could. The second change was how easily my memories began to rearrange themselves. Not disappear, reorganize. When I told stories about the past, I noticed how often I chose the version that aligned with his. Not because he insisted, but because it avoided friction. It kept things clean. If two memories conflicted, I learned to favor the one that sounded calmer. I called this objectivity. But late at night, I sometimes caught myself wondering why certain details felt blurry. Not forgotten, softened. Smoothed at the edges. As if they'd been handled too many times. Once, I tried to write something down exactly as I remembered it. Halfway through, I stopped. I wasn't sure which version I meant. The first time I realized this might be dangerous, I dismissed the thought immediately. Of course, memory changes. Everyone knows that. This wasn't manipulation, it was perspective. And yet, I noticed how often my uncertainty resolved itself in the same direction. Toward him. Not his opinions, his framework. I started using his language to describe my past. His distinctions. His way of categorizing motives and outcomes. It felt sophisticated. Analytical. But one evening, alone, I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If my memories keep changing, and they always change in the same way, at what point does reinterpretation become replacement? Which version of my past is mine? How do I know which version of myself I'm protecting? The question stayed with me longer than any doubt before it. I began testing myself in small ways. Recalling events without revising them. Letting memories surface without immediately correcting their tone. The results unsettled me. Some memories felt unstable. Not false. Not wrong. Just less certain than I'd believed. As if they'd been stored in a format that expected later editing. When I mentioned this to him, carefully, he didn't look surprised. Memory isn't meant to be preserved, he said. It's meant to be useful. I asked what that meant. It means you remember what helps you function, he replied. Not what happened. That sentence landed quietly and changed the way I listened to myself from then on. After that, I noticed how often my memories now served a purpose. They explained why I forgave. Why I stayed calm. Why I doubted myself before doubting him. Whenever a memory created conflict, it softened. Whenever it supported stability, it sharpened. I didn't do this consciously. It felt natural. Protective. Once, I remembered a conversation where I'd felt dismissed. I brought it up gently. He listened, then said, "That's not how it sounded to me." I hesitated. Not because I disagreed. Because suddenly, I wasn't sure. We talked it through. Calmly. Logically. By the end, my memory had changed shape, not erased, just reframed. Later, alone, I tried to recall the original version. I couldn't. The most unsettling part wasn't that my memories were shifting. It was how relieved I felt when they did. Uncertainty is heavy. Conflict is exhausting. But revised memories are lighter. Cleaner. They leave less to resolve. I started noticing how quickly I reached for reinterpretation when something hurt. How instinctively I explained it away before it could solidify. Not to protect him. To protect coherence. And that was when I finally understood the mechanism. I wasn't losing my memory. I was training it. Training it to preserve the version of reality that required the least resistance. And the thought I couldn't escape anymore was this. If memory can be trained to keep the peace, how long before it forgets how to tell the truth? The first time I tried to write a memory down, I treated it like evidence. Not poetry. Not reflection. Just facts. What was said. When. Where we were standing. Who ended the conversation. I told myself that if I could anchor it on paper, it would stay stable. Halfway through the page, I hesitated. Not because I didn't remember, but because I remembered two versions. One was sharper, more emotional. The other was calmer, more reasonable. I stared at the sentence, unsure which one belonged there. Finally, I chose the calmer version. It felt safer. Later, when I reread it, the sharper one had already started to fade. I tried again the next day with a different memory. Same problem. Each time I wrote, I noticed how easily language guided the outcome. A different verb, a softer adjective, a reordered sentence, and suddenly the memory changed its weight. I told myself this was normal. Writing always shapes experience. But then I noticed something else. Every time there was a choice between a version that blamed him and a version that blamed circumstance, my hand moved toward circumstance. Not consciously. Instinctively. I wasn't recording my past. I was editing it. The moment it frightened me came when I tried to capture something recent. An interaction from that same morning. Fresh enough that it shouldn't have been unstable. I began to write. Stopped. Crossed out a line. Rewrote it. Crossed that out too. After 5 minutes, I realized something unbearable. I no longer trusted my first draft of reality. Not because it was inaccurate, but because I'd learned that first versions were dangerous. They created conflict. They created questions. They disrupted coherence. And the truth I couldn't avoid anymore was this. I wasn't afraid of forgetting. I was afraid of remembering something that I would then have to live with. I tried to check my memory with someone else. Not dramatically. Casually. I mentioned an old moment, lightly, as if it were just a detail in conversation. I waited to see how they would describe it. Their version was different. Not opposite. Not shocking. Just shifted in small ways. The timing. The emphasis. The intention. I nodded, smiled, accepted it. But later, alone, I tried to place my version beside theirs. They didn't conflict. They overlapped. And suddenly I realized the problem wasn't that one of us was wrong. The problem was that I no longer had a version that felt final. Every memory now felt negotiable. The collapse didn't come from confusion. It came from choice. I noticed how, when faced with two versions of the same past, I selected the one that preserved stability. Not truth. Not accuracy. Stability. I chose the version where no one was at fault. Where no one had been careless. Where nothing needed to be confronted. And I understood then that this had become my system. Not forgetting. Not distortion. Selection. I was curating my own past to maintain the present. And once you see that you are choosing which memories survive, you can't pretend anymore that you're a victim of confusion. You are the editor. I don't tell this story as tragedy. Nothing dramatic happened. No moment I can point to and say this is where I lost myself. Because I didn't lose myself. I reorganized myself. I learned how to soften what hurt. How to reshape what threatened coherence. How to remember in a way that made life easier to continue. He never told me what to forget. Never asked me to change my past. Never touched my memories. He just taught me something far more dangerous. How to choose the version of reality that allows you to keep living with the people you don't want to question. And the quiet truth I live with now is this. When memory becomes a tool for peace, truth stops being something you search for. It becomes something you decide.